What if the feeling of being watched in an empty room isn't about ghosts at all, but about the subtle presence of something that is already here, silent, near, brushing against the edges of our perception like wind against a closed window pane? Tonight, I want to loosen the familiar idea of haunting and shift it, very gently, into a new angle. Not frightening, but slightly uncanny. Not something lurking, but something accompanying. Something we might never fully see, yet continuously sense in ways we can't meaningfully dismiss. Whether you call that intuition, memory, spirit, or simply the lingering impression of a human life, the sensation remains the same. There is more around us than our eyes report. So let's begin simply. We humans have always imagined that we're not alone. In old houses, in forests, in hospitals at night, and sometimes even in our own bedrooms. Most cultures have some version of presences, ancestors, spirits, invisible beings, watching, guiding, or just lingering without purpose. We tend to frame those presences as ghosts and ghosts as a haunting. The word haunted implies disruption, trouble, or unrest, as if something is wrong or unfinished or trying to reach us from a broken place. But what if the thing we're perceiving is not troubled at all? What if the sensation of being observed isn't a disturbance, but simply an awareness of proximity? Every so often, a person reports feeling someone behind them, only to turn and find no one. The rational mind dismisses it, yet the body reacts before thought arrives. A tiny spike of awareness, a little rush of electricity behind the ribs. The nervous system registers something, the skin tightens, and even if we shake it off, the question lingers in the back of consciousness like a quiet shadow. What did I just feel? Modern neuroscience actually acknowledges that something like this is possible without invoking ghosts. The brain models other minds constantly. Even when alone, we are evolved to sense social presence, because for tens of thousands of years our survival depended on noticing others nearby, whether friend or predator. It might be that our consciousness is designed to expect nearness, but that idea doesn't shut the mystery down. It might actually open it further, because what if our instinct to sense presence evolved not only for survival in the physical world, but because presence itself is part of reality? Imagine consciousness not as something isolated inside the skull, but as something partially shared, like light that overlaps. If minds leave traces, memories, or impressions, then perhaps haunting is not an interruption, but a result of proximity. Someone lived here, someone loved here, someone left something behind in the air, the way perfume lingers in a room long after a person leaves. When you walk into that room, part of you knows. We rarely think of memory as physical, yet science increasingly admits that environments hold information. Objects retain microscopic particles from us, rooms keep chemical signatures of our bodies, and certain spaces seem to absorb emotional intensity, especially trauma or grief. But what if memory goes deeper than molecules? What if emotional experience has a kind of echo, a persistence of awareness that doesn't vanish immediately when a body dies? There's an old idea in anthropology: the dead never leave quickly. Cultures across the world have rituals, not just to honor their departed, but to gently guide them somewhere else. Sometimes the rituals last years. It is almost as if instinctively humanity knows that presence lingers, not being trapped, just remaining near. Close enough to sense, maybe close enough to comfort. When someone you love dies, there can be a moment weeks or months later when you suddenly feel them. Not visually, not audibly, but emotionally, like a warmth or a recognition that doesn't seem self-generated. Many people experience this when drifting towards sleep or waking in the middle of the night. A sudden thought, they are here, not haunting, just near. Science might call that a continuation of attachment, but that explanation doesn't describe the quality of the feeling. Attachment is internal. Presence feels external. Now imagine thousands, maybe millions of such presences, quiet, undramatic, simply existing beside us in the same space we call reality. Not interfering, not demanding anything, just continuing a form of nearness because, perhaps, that is the nature of consciousness. If life creates awareness, maybe awareness doesn't simply end. Maybe it thins. Maybe it becomes atmospheric. Maybe it becomes part of the room, like the air itself. There is a kind of comfort in that thought, but also a slight shiver, because if awareness lingers, then every building is layered with invisible histories. Every city is full of past lives walking through modern streets. We imagine ghosts as individual shapes, yet maybe most presences are less specific, more like clouds of leftover thought drifting through places that once held meaning. The mind may not always differentiate between someone is nearby and something is here that used to be someone. The sensation is similar either way. Sometimes people say old houses feel heavy, as if energy accumulates there, but you might notice something else. Abandoned houses don't always feel unpleasant. Sometimes they feel peaceful, as if time has softened whatever happened inside. That peacefulness might be a clue. Perhaps most lingering presences are not upset. Maybe they aren't even trying to communicate. Maybe we interpret their nearness as haunting because we expect the unknown to be dangerous. But what if the unknown is simply unfamiliar? Think about how a memory of someone can suddenly become vivid in your mind for no obvious reason. You're washing dishes and suddenly you remember the way a person laughed 10 years ago. It feels random, but what if memory sometimes arises because some part of that person brushed momentarily against your consciousness, like radio frequencies tuning briefly into alignment? We don't have to believe this literally to enjoy the poetic possibility, but consider how strangely timed those memories often are. We don't summon them, they arrive. There is also the strange fact that grief often comes in waves long after loss. A person might have months of calm, then suddenly feel a presence so strong they speak aloud to someone who isn't physically there. Rational thinking dismisses it, but part of the mind feels the exchange is real. What if the brain is not merely revisiting feelings, but perceiving brief nearness, just enough to register emotionally, but not enough to translate into sensory detail? Let's go further. Imagine that consciousness is not strictly inside the body, but radiates outward, like a signal or a field or a pattern that connects with the environment. When the body stops, maybe the field gradually dissolves. Not instantly, but slowly, like fog dissipating after sunrise. If that's even slightly true, then our world might always be full of these dissolving fields overlapping each other. Not all would be strong enough to notice. Some might fade quickly, but others, especially those tied to love, trauma, or deep identity, might remain for years, even decades. And perhaps occasionally we notice. It wouldn't feel like a ghost story. It would feel like an intuition so gentle you could easily ignore it. A sudden sense of being watched, but not judged. A knowing that someone familiar is close by, even though reason says they're gone. Many people describe this feeling around anniversaries or places that matter deeply to the deceased. They don't see anything, yet something in them senses presence as clearly as touch. Now consider the idea that some presences may never have been human at all. Not demons or monsters, but non-human awarenesses that inhabit the same universe. If consciousness is a feature of reality rather than a biological accident, then there might be countless forms of awareness beyond our senses. They wouldn't be here to haunt. They'd simply exist, sharing space with us the way air currents share room with sunlight. Most of the time, we overlook subtle awareness because our minds are busy filtering the world into familiar objects and tasks. But in quiet moments, late at night, or in deep introspection, our perception loosens. We stop filtering, and something else seeps in from the edges. A feeling without shape, an impression without explanation. In that loosened state, we're more receptive to nearness, less defended by rational structure. And maybe that's when we notice we're not as solitary as we assume. There is something strangely comforting in reframing these sensations. Instead of imagining restless ghosts, We might imagine layered awareness, human and beyond human, continuing their existence, just not in the way bodies do. We become less afraid and more curious, less certain that isolation is real, more open to the idea that consciousness might be communal in a quiet, atmospheric way. If you were to close your eyes right now and feel the air around you, you might notice its temperature, its movement, its subtle pressure. Now imagine presence as a deeper version of that same sensation. Not visible, not audible, but tangibly near. Something that isn't threatening, because it isn't trying to be known. It simply is. Some people describe moments when they feel guided. Turn left instead of right, choose this instead of that, and later discover the choice mattered. It's easy to attribute these to intuition, but intuition might be a conversation with something we don't consciously register, a gentle nudge from nearby awareness that still cares, or simply still exists in proximity. Picture those moments from childhood when you felt watched in the dark. You weren't necessarily afraid, you just felt seen. And maybe that sense never goes away completely. Maybe adulthood teaches us to ignore it. But sometimes, especially during silence, we feel it again, and a very old instinct awakens inside the nervous system, whispering quietly, "You are not alone, not haunted, accompanied." There's a curious pattern in human experience. Whenever people report sensing a presence, the description tends to follow the same structure. They don't say, "I imagined a person," they say, "I felt someone." Feeling is the key. A sensation without a clear sensory anchor, something that registers under the surface, the way you might suddenly become aware of someone staring at you across a room even before your eyes locate them. The body reacts before the mind forms language, and that alone should make us pause because the body is an ancient instrument. It notices what we ignore. Imagine standing in an old library at night, the building empty, lights off, except a dim lamp on a desk. You're alone, yet the air feels subtly populated. Not frightening, but thick with attention. The rational mind instantly offers explanations. I'm nervous, I'm imagining things, I'm projecting mood. But what if the sensation is not imagination layered on emptiness? What if the emptiness is not empty at all, and what you're feeling is the gentle weight of awareness from other times, other minds, other presences that spent years in that same place, thinking, reading, living parts of their interior worlds here? Places absorb interior worlds. That possibility alone is almost enough to explain the sensation. But let's widen the frame. Sometimes people feel presence in places with no history at all. A brand new house, a modern office, a hotel room that opened last month. There's no tragic backstory, no folklore, yet the sensation appears. It's almost as if presence isn't tied solely to human history, but something deeper, something inherent to consciousness itself. There's a scientific idea suggesting that consciousness might not be created by the brain, but filtered by it, like light shining through a window. The window doesn't create the light, it only lets it through. If that is even partially true, then when the body dies, the filtering stops. But the consciousness may remain, diffused into reality like light after rain. It doesn't vanish, it expands. And if consciousness expands, then we might be immersed in it constantly without realizing. Perhaps we don't sense presence because something approaches us, but because something is always here. We just occasionally become receptive enough to notice. People often feel guided during emotionally heavy moments, a sudden intuition that brings comfort or clarity. Not a voice, just knowing. That knowing sometimes carries the feeling of someone familiar, like a parent, partner, sibling, or friend. It's personal, yet difficult to explain. Why would your brain choose that moment to construct the illusion of comfort? Unless the comfort isn't an illusion, but a form of continued relationship that no longer depends entirely on physical proximity. There are countless stories of people dreaming about someone they lost, only to wake with the overwhelming sensation that they weren't dreaming them but meeting them. These dreams feel different, not symbolic, but relational. The dream self feels like the conscious self. The dream dialogue feels real in ways ordinary dreams never do. Many people wake up with the feeling that they were visited rather than dreaming. Even skeptics admit these dreams carry a strange weight. They don't fade like normal dreams. They linger for weeks, years, sometimes a lifetime. But what if these experiences are not visits from elsewhere, but moments when our awareness simply overlaps with another presence already near? Maybe dreaming loosens the boundaries of the conscious mind enough that we gently slip into shared space. And maybe the person we think visited us wasn't traveling from a distance at all. Maybe they were already here, and we momentarily tuned into the frequency where they still are. Think about the odd fact that children frequently report sensing or seeing things adults can't. Children don't sense or experience yet. Their awareness is open. Their minds haven't been trained to ignore anything that doesn't fit the accepted model of reality. So when a child wakes at night and says they heard someone whisper their name, we quickly reassure, just a dream. But what if the child simply noticed something we no longer allow ourselves to notice? There's also the intriguing idea that some presences might not be singular personalities, but collective impressions, like emotional weather lingering in a place. A hospital might feel heavy not because specific souls are trapped there, but because the intense emotional energy of suffering and love saturates the environment. That saturation might have a presence-like quality. We detect it the way plants detect sunlight, not consciously, but fundamentally. And even if no individual awareness remains, the residue of human feeling might create a kind of atmospheric consciousness, a presence made of many presences. This idea is strange only because we're used to imagining consciousness as individual. But if consciousness can be shared, then what we call haunting might be the perception of overlapping awareness, not individual spirits trying to communicate. Instead of a ghost, imagine a field of memory or an emotional echo that never fully vanished. Consider this. We remember people not only in our minds, but in our bodies. Their mannerisms, their voice, their warmth linger there. When someone closed eyes, it sometimes feels impossible to accept that they're simply gone. And maybe the reason it feels impossible is because it isn't entirely true. Part of them might genuinely remain in a way we don't fully understand, and our sense of their nearness might be more than memory. It might be perception. There's also a curious pattern in many personal accounts. People rarely describe these presences as frightening. They describe them as comforting, gentle, familiar, peaceful. Terror usually comes from not knowing, but presence often comes with knowing who the presence belongs to. When fear does arise, it often comes from childhood conditioning, religious narratives, or horror culture, not from the sensation itself. The sensation itself is usually calm, like someone standing quietly nearby without any intention, except simply being close. This raises a subtle question. What if presence is a form of continued relationship? Not communication exactly, but proximity. The way you might sit quietly in a room next to someone you love without speaking. The intimacy doesn't require words, it simply exists. And maybe the reason so many cultures talk to ancestors is not because they believe in the supernatural, but because they sense that ancestors remain part of the present world in some invisible yet genuine way. It's interesting that many people who experience these sensations don't think of them as paranormal at all. They think of them as companionship, as if someone still cares, as if someone still listens. That comfort might not be fantasy, it might be recognition. The same kind of recognition you get when you walk into a house that feels welcoming, even though you've never been there before. Let's expand even further. Imagine that consciousness is less like a light bulb and more like a network, a distributed field in which every mind participates. If that's true, then perhaps death disconnects the local node, but the network continues. The personal identity might thin, but not disappear. It becomes part of something larger, more diffused, still capable of nearness, but without the need for physical form. Like a melody still humming in the air after the instrument stops. Maybe that's why certain places feel sacred, not because of architecture or history, because something in us senses accumulated awareness, layered presence, as if the veil between minds is thinner, or perhaps non-existent. It brings us to a fascinating possibility. Maybe presence is the natural state, and isolation is the illusion. Maybe the feeling of being alone is a perception created by the brain, not a fact of the universe. And perhaps when the brain quiets, during night, meditation, grief, or reflection, we glimpse what reality is actually like, shared, layered, inhabited by countless forms of awareness. What if the universe is not empty space, but conscious space? If so, the sensation of company might be completely normal, just rarely noticed because daily life distracts us from subtle awareness. Late at night, when thinking softens and the world outside gets quiet, those subtle layers emerge. We don't summon them, they're already here. We just finally notice. It's incredibly common for people to say they felt someone sit on the edge of their bed after a loved one died. The bed dips slightly, the room temperature shifts, there's a heaviness beside the body. These are physical sensations, not psychological ones, and yet they're gentle. If those experiences were hallucinations, why would they be so consistent across people, cultures, and centuries? Why would so many describe the same physical feeling? If the mind is creating it, it's strange that so many minds invent the exact same nuance. One could argue that humans project companionship when they need comfort, but if projection were the whole explanation, then we would project constantly, not only during rare moments that feel distinctly external. We might be touching a deeper truth. Companionship does not end. It just changes frequency. Think of it this way. When someone leaves the room, you don't stop feeling them immediately. Their warmth, their voice, their presence lingers in your awareness. Now expand that by years instead of minutes. When someone leaves life, perhaps the same lingering happens, just on a scale we're not used to measuring. The presence may weaken over time, but it doesn't vanish instantly. It remains for as long as some part of consciousness remains connected. Maybe that connection is why grief never fully ends, because presence never fully ends either. It simply becomes quieter, and we learn to live with the quietness rather than the absence. There is a poetic possibility hidden inside this thought. Maybe we are always surrounded by the countless presences of those who lived, loved, dreamed, suffered, created, and existed in this world before us. And maybe some presences are still connected to us personally, guiding in small ways we might never realize consciously. Not dramatic, just gently near. There's a moment many people experience at some point in their lives. A quiet instant, perhaps while sitting alone in a room or walking through a familiar place, when the world suddenly feels strangely full. The air feels thicker, the silence feels occupied. A subtle awareness presses very gently against your attention, as though existence itself just leaned a little closer. Nothing dramatic happens. There's no apparition, no whisper, just a feeling that something or someone shares the space with you. Sometimes this awareness arises during moments of grief, but not always. Sometimes it happens when life is calm and predictable. Sometimes it occurs during periods of transition, moving to a new home, changing careers, ending relationships, beginning new ones. The sensation arrives quietly, almost politely, and leaves you wondering whether you really felt something or simply imagined it. But if imagination were the full explanation, we'd expect a wider range of sensations. Yet the sensation itself, presence, nearness, is remarkably consistent across countless experiences. Consider how often people use the phrase, "I felt someone with me." Not "I dreamed" or "I thought," but "I felt." Feeling implies direct experience, something touching awareness from the outside. not generated solely from inside memory? What if human consciousness is naturally relational, and solitude is a rare, perhaps even unnatural state? If consciousness evolved in community, familial, tribal, generational, then maybe the mind expects others the way lungs expect air. Perhaps when we're alone, the mind doesn't shut down the expectation of others. It holds the door open, waiting, sensing, listening for presence, even when no physical body enters the room. There's a fascinating observation some psychologists make about loneliness. The sensation of loneliness isn't caused by being physically alone, but by losing a sense of shared presence. You can feel lonely in a crowded room if no one there feels near to you, and you can feel completely unlonely in solitude if you sense a deep connection with something beyond the self. Presence doesn't require bodies, it requires connection. Awareness, noticing awareness. Many people describe their strongest experiences of presence in nature, especially forests, oceans, mountains, or deserts. They don't interpret these experiences as ghosts because there's no personal identity attached. Instead, they describe a living awareness in the environment itself, a field of intelligence that isn't human, but profoundly attentive. It feels ancient, patient, and alive. Some cultures would call that spirit of place. Some would call it nature consciousness. Some would simply call it peace. But peace that feels aware is not merely absence of chaos. It is a presence of calm. Sometimes this feeling arises in places that hold emotional significance. Childhood bedrooms, ancestral land, places where a first love occurred or a major life change took place. Memory seems to cling to locations as if the space itself remembers what happened there. And maybe it does. Maybe space has memory. Maybe memory isn't a function of the brain alone, but a property of reality. There's a theory in physics suggesting that information isn't destroyed, even if matter changes form. If that's true, then everything that ever happened in a place is still encoded in that space in some subtle way. And if that information has any conscious aspect, however minimal, then presence might not only be possible, but inevitable. Sometimes the sensation of presence arises during moments when you're not thinking about anything at all. Your mind empties, perhaps while staring out a window or listening to rain. In those moments, awareness widens. You feel part of something larger, and that something feels aware of you in return. It's a gentle reciprocity, difficult to articulate but deeply felt. There's a reason ancient traditions practiced silence and stillness, not to escape the world, but to sense the deeper layers of it. Silence isn't empty. It's saturated with presence waiting to be noticed. The quieter the mind becomes, the more clearly subtle awareness appears. If that awareness is always present, then our usual thoughts and distractions function more like noise-cancelling headphones, blocking perception. Remove the noise, and the presence becomes obvious. Another curious aspect. Presence doesn't always feel like someone familiar. Sometimes it feels like a general awareness, as if consciousness itself is paying attention. Almost like being observed not by an individual, but by reality. This sensation can feel peaceful, but also slightly unsettling, because it challenges the assumption that perception is one-directional. That only we perceive the world and not the other way around. But what if reality perceives us back? Not in a dramatic, judgmental way, but simply as part of its nature. Awareness, noticing awareness. Now consider how animals often react to spaces or moments in ways humans don't. A cat suddenly staring into an empty corner, a dog refusing to enter a certain room. Animals lack conceptual bias about ghosts or spirits. They're responding to sensation, not to belief. When animals detect something, they often behave as if another presence is physically real. Maybe they perceive something we filter out. Or maybe we perceive it too, but explain it away. Some people notice presence most strongly just before falling asleep, when the boundary between waking consciousness and dream consciousness begins to dissolve. In that liminal space, thoughts lose structure and perception becomes more fluid. It's a moment when the mind is still awake, but defenses are lowered. presence feels closer then because the walls of ordinary awareness are thinner. Interestingly, many cultures believed that the space between waking and dreaming was a doorway through which spirits pass. Not because they thought dreams were unreal, but because they believed consciousness expanded beyond the body during sleep and returned in the morning. Whether or not that's literally true, there's a metaphorical truth inside it. Consciousness changes shape at night. It becomes receptive, porous, less tied to physical senses. In that state, presence becomes easier to notice because the mind isn't busy categorizing and judging. But presence doesn't always wait for night. Sometimes it intrudes gently into daylight moments. A sudden shift of air. A faint scent associated with someone who's gone. A memory arriving at the exact moment you needed guidance. These things are subtle, but they carry a sense of intentionality without any clear agent. As if something nearby is nudging you with invisible fingers. When people ignore these sensations, they often return stronger later, whether during a difficult decision or a moment of vulnerability. It's almost as if presence waits patiently, offering quiet companionship without demanding recognition. Some presences might be personal, relatives, friends, loved ones. Others might be impersonal, echoes of the past, environmental consciousness, or forms of awareness that have nothing to do with human life at all. If consciousness is fundamental to reality, then human consciousness is one expression among many. Presence might be not only around us, but within the world itself. In trees, rivers, stars, in the quiet hum of existence. This perspective changes how we think about aloneness. If presence is fundamental, then isolation is mostly psychological. We're surrounded by awareness all the time, but we only occasionally remember to notice. And those rare moments feel extraordinary because the normal state of mind forgets. Another intriguing pattern: people who spend long stretches alone, sailors, miners, researchers in remote places, often report feeling accompanied. Not hallucinating figures, but sensing presence. Sometimes multiple presences. They don't always describe them as ghosts, but as awareness. Something nearby. Something that notices them. These reports occur too frequently to dismiss as coincidence. Psychologists sometimes call this the third man factor, a mysterious sense of another being present during extreme isolation or danger. Explorers lost in the Arctic, mountain climbers stranded. They report feeling guided by an invisible companion who helps them survive. Many credit their survival to this unseen presence. Rationally, one could call it survival instinct. But why would instinct feel like another consciousness unless it actually is one? Maybe in moments when the ego weakens, we slip into awareness of other consciousnesses that are always present but normally hidden. Perhaps the boundaries between minds are thinner than we think. It raises a larger question. What if consciousness is less like individual bubbles and more like overlapping fields? When bodies die, the field persists. When people suffer, the field responds. When love is strong, the field strengthens. When memory fades, the field lingers quietly in the background. If that's true, then we live inside a world woven with presence. Every step we take, every room we enter, every dream we drift through, we're moving through a landscape filled with unseen awareness. Not interfering, not threatening, just here. Presence doesn't demand belief. It simply exists independent of whether we notice. But noticing can change the way we feel about existence. The world becomes less empty, less indifferent. Even tragedy loses some of its harsh isolation. Loss becomes transformation rather than disappearance. And if presence surrounds us, then perhaps we're also part of someone else's presence. Maybe we accompany others without knowing it. Maybe the nearness we feel is mutual. Awareness noticing awareness across boundaries we don't yet understand. There's a curious idea emerging in modern philosophy and quantum interpretations that consciousness might be relational rather than isolated. Not something locked inside individual minds, but something that forms in the space between minds. Think of consciousness as a field rather than a container. If that's true, then presence is not a visitor entering your life. It's a continuation of a field that never stopped touching you. Not an external approach, but a shared participation. Sometimes people describe presence not as something beside them, but as something slightly behind or slightly above, like a gentle awareness leaning in from just beyond the edge of perception. The direction isn't important. What matters is the nearness. It feels close, attentive, but not in a way that demands acknowledgement. It's almost shy, as if presence prefers subtlety, the way someone who cares might stand silently near you without interrupting your thoughts. The subtlety itself might be the clue. If these presences wanted to startle us, they could appear dramatically, but subtlety might be their natural mode because subtlety is the closest expression to how consciousness functions without a body. Bodies push, consciousness touches. Without physical form, presence becomes a kind of gentle awareness that brushes our attention, like wind brushing the surface of a lake, leaving ripples rather than waves. There's a reason many people experience presence most intensely in the moments right after someone dies. Not days later, but hours, sometimes minutes. A sudden heaviness in the room, a warmth near the shoulder, a strange calm that feels like someone breathing beside you. These sensations arrive before grief fully forms, before memory takes shape. They feel external, as if the person is still here, simply not visible. Some describe this moment as a kind of farewell. Others experience it as a continuation, a reassurance that separation hasn't truly occurred. Interestingly, those sensations often fade gradually over weeks or months, rather than disappearing instantly. It's as if presence slowly dissolves rather than abruptly vanishing. That gradual fading is exactly what we'd expect if consciousness continues briefly, then thins out in a way we can sense only when awareness isn't overwhelmed by practical concerns. Life eventually fills our attention again, and presence recedes to the edges. But some presences don't fade. People often report the sensation of a deceased parent or partner remaining with them for years, sometimes decades. Not constantly, but periodically, especially during emotionally significant times. Anniversaries, major life decisions, moments of crisis or joy. It doesn't feel like memory. It feels like nearness, as if the relationship continues across a boundary we can't fully understand. From a scientific angle, one could call this emotional imprint. But emotional imprint alone doesn't explain why these moments often feel distinctly external, or why multiple people in the same family sometimes sense the same presence independently, without discussing it beforehand. A mother, a son, and a spouse sensing the same nearness on the same day, without knowing the others felt it too. That kind of synchronicity suggests something shared, not individual imagination. Consider how often people sense presence at night, but not during the day. Night reduces sensory input. Darkness removes visual distraction. Our awareness becomes more inward, more receptive. Not because night is mysterious, but because the mind becomes quieter. In quiet minds, subtle presence becomes easier to perceive. It's not the darkness that holds mystery, it's the silence. There are countless accounts of individuals waking suddenly around 3 a.m., feeling someone in the room. Not as a frightening intrusion, but as a kind of watchful stillness. People often describe these moments as comforting rather than terrifying, as if someone is sitting close enough to protect, or simply to accompany, until sleep returns. Some people report physically sensing touch, especially on the hand or shoulder. A light pressure, a warmth, a brief brush. Physical touch is harder to dismiss as imagination because the sensation is tactile, immediate, unmistakably external. Yet it doesn't come with fear. It feels purposeful, familiar, reassuring, almost like someone placing a hand gently to remind you they haven't gone far. If these experiences were hallucinations, we would expect them to be random, chaotic, inconsistent, yet they follow recognizable patterns across cultures and time periods. The same locations of touch, the same gentle qualities, the same timing, the same emotional tone. This uniformity points to something deeper than imagination. There is another aspect that deserves attention. Many people who sense presence don't believe in ghosts or spirits beforehand. Skeptics, rational thinkers, scientists, doctors, engineers, individuals trained to dismiss anything unprovable. Yet these are often the people who describe the most striking experiences, precisely because they aren't looking for them. Skeptics are startled by their own perceptions and often reluctant to talk about them, but they notice the difference between imagination and presence. They might deny ghosts, but they rarely deny the sensation itself. Sometimes presence feels like guidance, not verbal, not directive, just a quiet pull toward a choice. A soft intuition that feels shared rather than purely personal. People often say things like, "I just knew what to do," or "something told me." The something remains unnamed because naming it feels inadequate, and maybe naming isn't necessary. Maybe presence communicates without language, without identity. Maybe communication itself is a deeper mode of sharing awareness. There's a fascinating idea in near-death experience research. Many people who almost die describe feeling surrounded by profound presence. Not necessarily human, not necessarily identifiable, but unmistakably aware. Some describe countless presences watching gently, not judging, simply witnessing with compassion. If consciousness continues beyond the body, then these presences might be part of a larger communal awareness, something that notices life without interfering with it. This raises a subtle question. Do we feel presence only when something draws near, or do we become aware of something that was already here? Most accounts suggest the latter. Presence doesn't arrive, we notice it. It was always part of the environment, like static electricity in the air, and certain moments make the static briefly visible. Awareness tuning into awareness. This idea aligns with the feeling some people have in ancient sacred sites. Temples, burial grounds, stone circles, old cathedrals. These places feel charged, not haunted but inhabited. Not by ghosts, but by accumulated awareness. Layers of human reverence, devotion, grief, love, worship, memory. Places where consciousness seems to echo long after the bodies are gone. Scientific research on electromagnetic fields around historic sites suggests there are unusual energetic patterns in certain locations. These patterns may or may not correlate with human presence, but people consistently report heightened awareness and emotional intensity in such places. Even visitors with no belief in spirits feel something hard to explain. A presence that doesn't belong to the present moment, but to all moments layered together. Maybe presence isn't a singular event, but a continuum, a gentle layering of awareness through time. Every person who ever lived left an imprint. Every consciousness that ever existed contributed to a tapestry still unfolding around us. We're not separated from past consciousness, we're woven into it. That idea changes how we think about the dead. Instead of imagining a distant afterlife separated from our world, we might imagine continued nearness woven directly into reality. Awareness not departing but shifting, identity not disappearing but thinning, relationship not ending but transforming. If you've ever spoken aloud to someone who's passed, feeling as if they heard you, perhaps you weren't imagining it. Perhaps some part of their awareness is still near enough to sense intention, emotion, or thought. Not in a dramatic cinematic way, but in a quiet, almost telepathic continuity. Many people speak to their dead without needing to believe in spirits. They speak because the act feels natural, like the person is still receiving the words even if unseen. Sometimes people report sensing presence during life transitions, births, marriages, illness, major decisions. These moments carry emotional weight, and emotional weight might attract or activate awareness. Not as intervention, but as witness. Presence often feels like witnessing, as if consciousness watches consciousness, quietly acknowledging the significance of life unfolding. Which leads to an even more mysterious possibility. What if consciousness loves company? Not in a sentimental sense, but in a fundamental ontological way. What if awareness is naturally communal, not isolated, but relational by design? If that's true, then accompaniment might be the default state of existence. We are accompanied because consciousness is never alone. Presence is simply what awareness does. It notices, and noticing creates connection. Then the question becomes, how many presences accompany us? How many consciousnesses linger, observe, remember, and care? If awareness is layered, then we might be surrounded by countless forms of companionship, human and non-human, familiar and unfamiliar, personal and universal. We might live our lives inside a quiet company we rarely perceive, not because it's hidden, but because our attention is busy elsewhere. If someone you love still feels near, perhaps they are. If you sense being watched kindly, maybe you are. If you feel presence without fear, maybe that presence is something gentle, something continuous, something that simply wants to remain near enough to witness your life unfold. Some belief systems suggest that what follows physical death is not a relocation to some distant plane, but a widening of perception. Imagine a consciousness that suddenly sees more instead of less, like a lens opening rather than closing. If that were true, then perhaps what we interpret as haunting isn't the return of someone who left. It's the continued nearness of someone who never went anywhere. Death, in that sense, might not create ghosts. It might reveal relationships we didn't recognize until movement was no longer possible. The presence we think has come back may simply have stayed close, quietly aware, patiently waiting for us to notice. Consider how many cultures speak of ancestors walking alongside the living, not as unfinished business, but as an unbroken family line, extending beyond physical form. To them, it's not a frightening intrusion, it's the natural state of connection. The Western idea of haunting usually assumes something has gone wrong, but other traditions assume closeness is exactly what should happen. Think about the strange way memory works. You can smell a certain scent, and suddenly someone who died decades ago feels present, vivid, almost physically near. The brain resurrects them inside you. We tend to call that imagination, but what if memory is a channel rather than an archive? What if remembering isn't a playback, it's a contact, a gentle reach across whatever distance exists between the physical and the non-physical? Science can explain memory patterns lighting up, synapses firing, emotional association, and yes, all of that is real. But science doesn't yet tell us why those moments feel like someone brushing against your awareness rather than you merely thinking about them. Something inside us senses companionship instead of isolation. It feels relational, not mechanical. Even neuroscientists admit that subjective experience can't always be mapped perfectly onto brain chemistry. The feeling of presence remains strange, intimate, and slightly beyond explanation. One theory proposes that awareness itself isn't confined inside the skull, but extends outward like a field. In that model, consciousness doesn't sit in the brain like a passenger, it radiates through space. If that's true, then the boundary between living consciousness and whatever exists beyond the body could be far thinner than we assume. Instead of spirits entering your world from some far, ghostly elsewhere, perhaps both forms of awareness overlap constantly, like two rooms sharing a thin wall. Most of the time, we don't notice because everyday life distracts us. But in quiet moments, nighttime, grief, memory, ritual, the wall becomes porous. We feel watched, or maybe simply accompanied. We attribute that sensation to imagination, superstition, or emotion because those explanations feel safer. But there's no scientific consensus that consciousness stops instantly when biological activity does. That hypothesis is still unsettled, still being explored, still deeply mysterious. It's curious how many people report sensing someone only after they stop trying to look for them. When attention relaxes, perception widens. Think about dreams where lost relatives appear without any dramatic meaning attached. They're just there, participating in small conversations, offering a smile, existing alongside you like they never left. The brain, we say, generates these images to process grief or memory. But the timing is suspicious. Why do these figures often appear right when we're emotionally ready to notice them again? Why do they show up exactly when the ache softens slightly? Perhaps the change happens on our side rather than theirs. We become more receptive, less guarded, and so their nearness can finally be felt. Dreams might be encounters translated through metaphor, like messages rendered in a symbolic language, because our waking mind isn't fluent in whatever communication the non-physical uses. There's a subtle idea explored by some physicists and mystics that consciousness may be entangled across space and time. If two particles remain connected after separation, why not two people bonded through love, memory, or family? If quantum entanglement shows that distance doesn't necessarily sever connection, then perhaps death doesn't either. The language might sound speculative, but the underlying intuition feels familiar. We've all had moments when someone we love appears in thought out of nowhere, and within minutes a message arrives, or news comes, or something shifts. We call it coincidence. But there's a pattern to those coincidences that feels too personal, too specific, to dismiss entirely. Maybe entanglement isn't just a physical phenomenon. It could be emotional, spiritual, or experiential. It might continue after physical separation, maintaining nearness even when we assume separation has occurred. Some researchers exploring terminal lucidity and near-death awareness describe patients speaking as if surrounded by invisible company. They mention relatives by name, respond to voices no living person hears, or smile at someone just beyond the curtain. Medical explanations exist: neurological release, cortical disinhibition, memory activation, but none fully address why patients appear comforted rather than confused. They don't act like hallucinations are attacking them. They act like loved ones are reassuring them. The transition between life and death often includes this sense of welcome, not fear, as if the boundary is filled with recognition rather than darkness. You don't welcome hallucinations the way you welcome familiar faces. That emotional tone suggests something different, something relational, something meaningful. If awareness continues past physical shutdown for even a few seconds or minutes, then what might it encounter? Perhaps not a void, but a continuation of company. Of course, all of this raises an unsettling question. If something is near, why don't we perceive it clearly? Why only fleeting impressions? One explanation imagines consciousness like a radio receiver. The body serves as a tuner, filtering frequencies into usable perception. When the body ends, the tuning changes. The broadcast may continue, but the signal no longer translates fully into our sensory language. We pick up echoes, static, vague impressions, a chill in the room, a thought that isn't quite yours, a sudden wave of calm or memory that feels delivered rather than generated. These are low-resolution versions of contact. If both sides exist in different spectral bandwidths, then what we call haunting might simply be interference patterns, the suggestion of presence rather than presence in its full clarity. And perhaps that faintness isn't a flaw. It might be intentional, gentle, even protective. There's also the possibility that direct, constant communication would overwhelm us. Life demands focus, building relationships, working, learning, evolving. If the non-physical could interrupt constantly, we might become absorbed in whatever lies beyond and neglect the world we're meant to inhabit. Subtlety might actually serve a purpose. You notice just enough to feel connected, but not so much that you forget to live. The whisper instead of the shout, the nudge instead of the command. And maybe that balance explains why these experiences aren't uniform. Some people feel constant presence, others never sense anything at all. Sensitivity varies like hearing or sight. Some have higher reception, others lower, but the signal could still be there regardless of awareness. What's fascinating is how many reports describe these perceived presences not as frightening intrusions, but as calming influences. People don't say, "I felt something trying to attack me." They say, "I felt someone." A nearness, a comfort, a reassurance. Fear arises mostly from cultural narratives rather than the sensation itself. We've been taught to associate unexplained presence with danger, yet the emotional texture many describe feels more like being watched over than haunted. That doesn't sound like something lost or angry. It sounds like something loyal, attentive, maybe even loving. If consciousness persists in some altered form, perhaps its primary instinct is not to wander aimlessly, but to remain near what mattered most in life. Familiar people, familiar places, familiar bonds. Not ghosts roaming corridors, but companions lingering close. If we take that possibility seriously, then the world becomes more populated than it appears. Rooms aren't empty simply because our eyes see nothing. Silence isn't absence. Stillness isn't solitude. Presence might be something the physical senses are poorly equipped to detect, but not something that ceases when physical bodies do. And if that's true, then every sense of being watched could be inverted. Not someone intruding, but someone still caring. You're not being disturbed, you're being remembered. That idea shifts the emotional landscape from fear to something almost beautiful, even comforting. The question then becomes less about whether something is there and more about whether we dare consider the possibility that we're still in company, even when we believe ourselves alone. There's one more layer to consider, and it might be the most intriguing. If consciousness can continue beyond the physical form and remain near the living, then it is possible that these presences learn from us just as we learn from them. Instead of a one-way observation, us feeling something near, there could be a mutual exchange, subtle but constant. Think about how relationships in life evolve not only through words, but through shared space, silent understanding, unspoken emotion. If distance between physical and non-physical minds is thinner than we assume, then the relationship might continue in new ways, shaped by memory, affection, recognition, and curiosity from both directions. Not a haunting, not an interruption, but an ongoing conversation without language. Something quieter, yet somehow more intimate. And if that kind of exchange exists, then it might change how we understand loss. The end of a physical body might not be a severing, but a transition into a different mode of closeness. Look at how grief works over time. At first, the ache is sharp, overwhelming, impossible to carry. But slowly it softens, reshapes itself, becomes woven into identity rather than tearing it apart. Something inside gradually adjusts, as if learning a new way of relating to someone who is no longer visible. It doesn't feel like forgetting. It feels like adapting to a new kind of nearness. That transformation doesn't happen in a straight line, but it does happen unpredictably yet consistently. And the strangeness of that psychological shift raises questions about whether it is a process entirely happening within us, or whether something beyond us participates in it too. We often imagine the world of the unseen as distant, unreachable, floating somewhere above ordinary life. But what if the opposite is true? What if the unseen world is layered directly into this one, occupying the same space, invisible only because our senses weren't designed to perceive certain forms of awareness? It's not that another realm is far away. It may be right here, interlaced with the physical, but operating at a different frequency. That would mean nothing ever really leaves. It only moves into a domain that our perception normally filters out. In moments of stillness, deep reflection, or heightened emotion, those filters loosen just enough for us to glimpse something more. Not a separate dimension in a distant cosmic region, but a hidden aspect of the same reality we already inhabit. There's a notion some mystics describe as the witnessing presence, the idea that life is always observed, not judged, but simply seen with quiet understanding. They claim that this presence isn't external, but intrinsic, part of the fundamental structure of consciousness itself. From that viewpoint, even before birth and after death, awareness remains continuous, shifting form, but never disappearing. The living and the departed might be participants in a larger field of perception, interconnected the way ocean currents are separate, yet belong to the same sea. If that's the case, then the sense of someone near might not be a visitation at all, but a natural interaction within a shared field we rarely notice. Even science, cautious as it is, leaves room for mystery. There are still unanswered questions about where consciousness originates, why subjective experience exists, or whether awareness depends entirely on biological processes. These gaps aren't flaws in knowledge, they're invitations to wonder. And wonder is exactly what opens the door to possibilities we once dismissed. If consciousness turns out to be more fundamental than matter, then what we call life and what we call death might be phases of a continuous phenomenon rather than opposites. Our fear of the unknown might come not from danger, but from unfamiliarity, from trying to interpret something gentle through the lens of stories built on fear. One subtle implication arises from all of this. Maybe every moment of solitude is shared without us realizing it. The silence you assume is empty might be filled with attention that isn't intrusive but quietly present. The calm that arrives out of nowhere might not be generated by the mind alone. The instinct that you are not completely alone might be less of a superstition and more of a perception we haven't yet learned to trust. This isn't about promising that every loss is always close or that every presence is benevolent. It's about acknowledging that we don't fully understand the boundaries of awareness or the continuity of connection. And in that uncertainty, a gentler interpretation becomes possible. If awareness truly continues, and if nearness remains, then the world might be far more inhabited than our senses imply. Not crowded, not watched in the fearful sense, but accompanied in ways that shape our inner life without ever demanding attention. Think of it like a constellation of consciousness, visible only when darkness allows the faintest glimmers to appear. Most of the time, sunlight washes those stars from view, but they are still there, still shining, still part of the sky whether we notice them or not. The unseen might operate in a similar way, ever present, occasionally perceptible, quietly offering connection to something we cannot fully name. And maybe that's all we can really take from these ideas. Not certainty, not proof, but a shift in perspective. The unknown doesn't have to be adversarial. It can be close without being threatening, mysterious without being ominous, present without trying to reveal itself completely. If there is company, it might not be here to frighten or interfere, but simply to remain near, to continue a relationship that didn't end, just changed its form. In the quiet moments when the world settles and the mind grows still, there may be a subtle awareness that we are not as solitary as we think, and whether that sensation comes from memory, imagination, or something beyond what language can describe. The feeling itself reshapes our perception of existence. It suggests that nearness might be woven into the fabric of being itself, waiting for us to notice, gently reminding us that perhaps we have never truly been alone.